Alrighty. Good afternoon, all. Welcome to the last panel of the day. Today, in this panel, our esteemed panellists are going to be talking through some of the results we've seen so far, what these mean in kind of institutional terms, and what some of the implications might be. Our first panellist is Lachlan Poel, who's a PhD candidate at Flinders. Lachlan's work looks at political mis and disinformation, and he's also a self-avowed kind of elections tragic. We also have Emerita Professor Kathy Mack, whose extensive catalogue of work focuses mostly on judges and judging, and she'll be talking to us a lot today about the implications for the Supreme Court and the mechanisms of that. And on the end here, we have our esteemed Centre Director of the Jeff Bleich Centre, Professor Rodrigo Praino, who's put together this fantastic event today. In terms of his work and interests, he works a lot on electoral behaviour, particularly the impact of scandals on political popularity and the benefits of incumbency as well. So hopefully this will be a fascinating panel session for you all at the end of the day. To start us off, I guess I'll just open it to the panel. Where do we kind of sit at the moment? Where's the race at?
If you're a Democrat, not in a particularly good spot at the moment. So obviously behind in the presidency race, almost to the point where I think it's just about done. But then you start looking at, okay, the presidency, were they able to hold the Senate? Can they win the House? The Senate has flipped. So the Republicans have flipped West Virginia, which was Joe Manchin's seat, which was one I think everyone expected to go because Joe Manchin had held on to that, I think through sheer force of will. Sherrod Brown, who was the senator for Ohio, was trying to run ahead of the Harris ticket and see if he could hold on. Harris ended up losing Ohio by 11, and whilst Brown was about 4 or 5 points in front of that, he won't survive. John Tester in Montana, I think, is almost certainly flipped. And then you start looking a little further down the board, and Alyssa Slotkin is down 5 points currently in Michigan, and Republicans are ahead in both Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, although those two are probably within about a point or two. All that being said is that if Republicans were to sweep the board across there in all 6 of those, that you could be looking at something that looks like Republicans with 55 seats in the Senate. As it stands, they almost certainly have 52, and the question is how many more do they pick up from there? If you're a Democrat on the Senate side, there's not really a lot of good news coming through. Probably the only one is in Arizona, which was Kirsten Sinema's seat. Gallego is currently leading that quite comfortably. He's running 7 points in front of Harris. So has been able to dodge the underperformance that Harris has had with Hispanic voters. And then if you look at the House, I mean, we're not going to know the results of the House for probably 3 or 4 weeks whilst California decides to get its act together and count all the ballots coming in. But in the results we do have, it seems reasonably tight. I think there's still a chance that the Democrats can win the House. But I think regardless, you're going to be looking in somewhere along the lines with where whoever doesn't win is only going to be probably 210, 212 seats. So they're not going to be particularly far behind. And if we look at the troubles the Republicans had with such a small majority in the House in terms of electing a speaker, it's entirely possible that could continue. And just a point I'd like to make is that just because we've seen Republicans do quite well along there, there's been some, I suppose, if you're a progressive or a liberal, some positives. For example, in Missouri, a ballot measure to legalise abortion, increase the minimum wage and reject police pay all passed, despite voting for Trump and Josh Hawley. So figure that one out. But I think that speaks to the partisanship. But I'm happy to pass it on now to the others.
Yeah, I'll just interject for a second because as you were speaking, CNN has just called the projection of Georgia going to Donald Trump. That is a big one. That is a very big one because Georgia was determinant last time around, 16 electoral college votes. It was one of the 7 battleground states, so now he has already 2 out of the 7. Georgia was one of those that there was a possible path of victory for Harris. Again, it doesn't mean anything at this stage yet, but again, it's another little piece of the puzzle. I think with that played out the way it has, Georgia going to Donald Trump, with the Senate wins that we've seen, it's looking more and more likely that Trump is going to win this election. It's looking more and more likely that the Republicans are getting him. You know, they as Lachlan said, they already flipped the Senate, so I would say that that's fair to call. We will still need, as you said, to wait for the House. There is possibility. It isn't like I'm not very optimistic, but we could be looking at a Congress entirely dominated by the Republican Party and with a presidency Republican. Now, whether the House is Democratic, whether the House is Republican, does it really matter? It isn't. American politics and American congressional politics is not exactly like in Australia. Australia has very strong political parties. We have what we call disciplined political parties. Why is that? Because political parties in Australia have a very important tool at their disposal, and it's good old blackmail. That's it, right? Why? If you don't follow the party line, you no longer get nominated as a candidate for your party. And everyone knows that. So no one in Australia, it's very rare that anyone in Australia votes against their own political party. In the United States, over many years, American political parties ended up losing that right. They don't nominate anyone as their candidate. They go for primary elections. So we tend to think, when we talk about primary elections, there's a massive democratic feature of the American political system that's amazing. Americans, not only do they vote for the person who wins the election, they also get to vote, they also get to choose who runs for the election. Now, the truth of the matter is that on paper, it looks very democratic. It looks like an amazing feature of the American political system. The problem with that is that turnout, especially for primary elections, is quite low. They typically have multiple candidates in both camps. So you're talking, if you talk 30% turnout for a primary election, divided over two parties, let's assume it's half and half, so 15 and 15 for each, right, of the parties. In a camp that has 5, 6, 7 candidates with like quite, even split of votes, you're talking 2, 3, 4, 5% of the population choosing the candidate for the entire party. Donald Trump would not have been a thing in a country without primary elections, right? So that tells you how these decisions are influential. Now, by eroding the power of the political party, what happens? Whether the Republicans or whether the Democrats win the House and the Senate isn't as consequential as it would be for us to say our House of Representatives belongs to this party or that party, or our Senate belongs to this party or that party, the majority, right? Every single piece of legislation that an administration wants to bring forward ends up being negotiated almost individually with every member of Congress. Now, Donald Trump has a particular pull over the Republicans, right? I often meet with members of Congress in the U.S. and they, my take is that a lot of the Republican members of Congress seem to be scared of Donald Trump. You can tell, right, when they're talking that like their eyes is saying something and their mouth is saying something else, and it's sort of like, yes, but there is that hesitancy. That hesitation that they read in their behavior, their non-spoken behavior. So Donald Trump is a little bit different. So he has a little bit of stronger pull on his party than others. But the truth of the matter, like I remember even Barack Obama, when I was living in the U.S. when he was pushing through Obamacare, right? Massive flagship Democratic project, and I remember him negotiating with. I lived in Connecticut at the time. I remember him negotiating with Chris Dodd, who was senator for Connecticut. He negotiated his support for Obamacare by giving $200 million to build a building at the University of Connecticut. the building was for medical research, but so it was just mildly related to healthcare. But that was the only way for him to get support for the bill. So that was someone from his own party on a deeply blue state that generally should not be against that kind of initiative. So that shows you how important the negotiation is. So again, having the House and the Senate possibly going to the Republicans, it will be complicated if Harris ends up victorious. It's not looking like that's going to happen, at least not at this moment in time, looking at what I can see being projected and being tallied at this stage. But having a Republican Congress with a Republican president doesn't mean that he can push through anything he wants. He still will have to negotiate with every member of Congress.
Thanks. Just to expand on that a touch, the House of Representatives has a complete spill every 2 years. All 435 members are up for election every 2 years. So that, although you're absolutely right about the lack of discipline, as the earlier panel was talking about money, that means that every member of the House is constantly running for re-election. They're never actually secure in their job. So that affects a lot of that affects their allegiance to the party if the party is going to give them money. I think that's a fair comment. In the Senate, it's a little bit different. I think the senators, the structure of the Senate, there's 100 members. There's 2 senators for every state, and they're elected statewide. They're not elected by district the way members of Congress are or members of the Australian Parliament are. And I think a Senate term is for 6 years, so you're pretty secure for several years. A third of the Senate is up for re-election every 2 years. So this year, 33 senators were up for election, 67 were not. And it was a very bad year for the Democrats because of those 33, 23 were Democrats and only 10 were Republicans. And of those Democrats, 3 were in states that were three were in states that were going to go for Trump. So they were swimming against the tide, and they have already lost that race. And several others were in swing states, which are turning out to swing for Trump. So they were always kind of up against it in terms of holding the Senate. Now, I was going to move on to what I had hoped to talk about, which is the role of Senate, some of the distinct roles of Senate. Are we ready?
Yeah, I think so. I think we spent a lot of time today talking about the executive and the legislature. I think it's important, as Kathy said, to now talk about what's the impact of that on that third branch, the judiciary.
Okay, well, when I started this, I had a few different scenarios, a Democratic president, a Republican Senate. Well, let's not go there. I mean, it's, that's, it's, or a Republican president and a Democratic. Yeah. The important thing about the Senate that's very different from Australia, in the U.S., the Senate, there are all members of the federal judiciary, whether it's the lower courts, the appeal courts, or the Supreme Court, have to be confirmed by the Senate before they can take office. So the president nominates someone, they're then considered by a Senate committee, and then they're voted on by the full Senate to get that position or not. There are also about 1,400 federal executive positions that are subject to Senate confirmation as well, ranging from cabinet members to undersecretaries to heads of various commissions. It's quite a large number. So the Senate has this very distinctive role in relation to the executive positions, which is not the case here in Australia. And so I think that really changes the importance of the Senate. It obviously has legislative importance, as does the House. The House has no role in this confirmation of executive or judicial appointments. So we're only talking about the Senate here. So it really doesn't matter for what I'm talking about whether the House does become Democratic or whether it stays Republican. That's formally doesn't change this. Until about 20 years ago, judicial nominees were seen as a bipartisan process. As long as the nominee was reasonably well qualified, they got approved. And about 20 years ago, that changed. And I'll talk a bit about both what happened under Obama and what happened under Trump, because it gives you exactly the contrast. Under Obama, the Republicans held the Senate. And towards the end of Obama's term, they blocked virtually every nominee, no matter qualified or not. It just didn't matter. And there was a huge set of federal vacancies by the time Trump came into office. But the most vivid example of that blocking, there are lots of examples, but the most vivid one was when Justice Scalia of the U.S. Supreme Court died in February. Within hours of his death, McConnell, who was the leader of the Senate, the Republican leader of the Senate, said they would not consider Obama's nominee to replace him because Obama was a lame duck. There was a year to go in his term, but he could not be president again. So he was a lame duck, so they weren't going to consider it. Now, flash forward, when Ruth Bader Ginsburg died in September, 2 months before the election in that year, at which Trump was running for re-election, McConnell pushed through the confirmation of Amy Coney Barrett as Ginsburg's successor within about a month, even though Trump's term was going to end in 4 months, or could be ending in 4 months. So the obvious partisanship, the hypocrisy, to not put too fine a word on it, is staggering in terms of the way that judicial confirmations have been handled. And it shows up in other ways. So Trump comes into office with 3 or 4 times more vacancies than a president is usually faced with. His nominees were not just approved, but they were fast-tracked. And I can say more about that, but I think we'll just leave it for that. That's really the significance of what's going on here will be that the federal judiciary will be dramatically affected.
Yes, thank you for that, Kathy. And I think it's important to note, the result of elections today has long-standing institutional impact in those other branches of government. It's not just about who's elected today, it's who those people confirm and appoint going forward. And so I guess that kind of turns us to, do we think this is a race that's been run on kind of local issues at the constituency level? You know, the old quote, all politics is local, or is this a national race? What's the kind of panel's feeling on that?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I think that the race was run on different sets of issues, right? If you look at what the candidates have done, for Donald Trump as the challenger, right? So the person who is challenging the current administration, the main point for him to stick to was going to always be the economy. Now, the economic situation of the U.S. is not great. It's not terrible either, right? It has been improving, especially in recent months. But most families feel the cost of living crisis. The inflation is a problem. There is an ongoing issue with manufacturing, right? Because obviously the loss of manufacturing jobs has been historically now like something that has been happening in the U.S. And so Trump tried to push forward that story, right? And I would say more than Trump himself, his campaign tried to push that story. Trump can't be made to push anything really. So he's been told by his advisors, if the voters go to the polling booth with the economy on their minds, they are going to vote for you. Now, I would go even further and say that if anyone else was running in place of Donald Trump, with the kind of numbers that we see coming out of what people think, how things are going and how they approve, even the approval rate for Joe Biden, the way that they think the economy is going, the way they think the country is headed, with those kind of numbers, it would definitely be a landslide for the Republican Party. Now, Donald Trump is very divisive. Donald Trump is different. So he had this message. At the beginning of the campaign, the story was immigration. That was being pushed forward. I said this morning, even if you watch the Republican National Committee conference in July, it was all centered on immigration, the danger of immigration, et cetera, et cetera. That kind of died off a little bit throughout the last few weeks or months. But that was his idea. For Kamala Harris, instead, her message was different, and it wasn't really local. It was really global, right? It was democracy. Democracy is at stake. Democracy is at risk, and so freedom is at risk. And so all of the issues that we debated in the panel before this one about women's rights, etc., they feed into that rhetoric. And she tried very hard to make sure that people understood what was at stake. What is interesting at the local level to me is the idea that turnout seems to have been record high, right? They're not reporting the numbers. I can't see just watching the screen as we're talking, but this morning alone, there were about something like 19 million votes had already been cast as early voters. Turnout is record high, apparently, this time around. And historically, when turnout is high, the Democratic Party wins, right? The Democratic Party has an advantage. Now, this time around, though, Donald Trump has asked people to come out and vote that has never voted before, right? So it will be interesting to see when we have the data available, who are the people that turned out to the polls? Who are these? Did he manage to get through his message to these religious groups, for example, of people who typically don't engage? Now, if you look at what they're predicting right there, so we've got Wisconsin, he's up. We've got Michigan, he's way up, and we've got Pennsylvania with him being up as well. Now, of course, they moved the thing, but it doesn't matter. Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan typically vote together. Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan are three states, especially Michigan, Detroit, the car industry of the United States that is in shambles. Michigan, the Wisconsin as well, and Pennsylvania, especially the western part of Pennsylvania, was the industrialized area of the state that no longer exists the way that it did before. So if that message of I'm going to bring back American jobs, I'm going to put tariffs against China, I'm going to make sure that things are produced in the United States, if that goes across, then it's not surprising that Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania go for Donald Trump.
I guess I'll throw it to the panel. Do these shifts mean something long term? Are these permanent now? Is this the new shape of American politics? Does the Rust Belt vote red?
I think that being able to draw long-term conclusions out of this will make a fool out of us all, because I think after 2020 we all sat here.
I have to try.
Yeah, I think after 2020 we all, some people sat here and said this is a massive long-term realignment, and here we are 4 years later. I certainly think we've become far more polarised in the sense that red areas have become more red and blue has become more blue, but I think that some of the changes we saw in 2020 have reverted. I think Harris's numbers amongst the suburbs are not quite as strong as they were, but also that voters, whilst voting on particular issues, are maintaining their partisanship when it comes to state races. As an example, if I bring up, Florida had a ballot measure on the books about a constitutional right to abortion, which passed, which was 57-42. Now, for this, it had to get 60% of the vote to pass. So it did fail, but 57% of Floridian voters voted in favour of a constitutional right to an abortion. And yet you look at the Floridian results and they were abysmal for the Democrats tonight. They were statewide and at a local level, they were abysmal. Missouri's ballot measure looks like it's going to pass, and they got beaten there comfortably too. So I think there's a big gap between those two. So I think what it says is that the partisanship has gotten stronger, but voters are still making independent decisions on ballot measures that are not partisan, But I think trying to draw long-term conclusions out is a fool's errand, although I'm sure people will try over the next 6 to 12 months as they post-mortem some of these events.
Well, as you'll see, I'm wearing an Obama T-shirt, and I find it so interesting, and this is where the political scientists can perhaps answer, because I'm a lawyer, that so many people who voted for Obama vote for Trump. And I find that just puzzling. And some of the explanations that have been given are, there's a lot of them. But I think that part of it, what it seems to me, is that Obama gave people something to vote for. And I think one of the weaknesses of Harris's campaign was that she made it about Trump. It seemed to me she made it a referendum on Trump, and wasn't able to cut through on how she made people feel. That she talked about abstractions like democracy, but people, and the previous panel said they were going to talk about emotions, and I think the way people feel about someone is so powerful. Even they will vote for someone who makes them feel a certain way, even when it's not necessarily in policy interests. And I think Trump generated fear. He spoke to those who were aggrieved, but he also purported to offer an answer for that. And I think that's the politics of fear is, I think, in my view, a very low form of politics, but it's a very effective one. And I think those numbers could change, but it would take a Democrat who can generate those feelings that Obama did of hope and trust and a kind of positivity and a sense, and what Bill Clinton did so well, he felt their pain, and I think Democrats, since Clinton and Obama, I don't think the Democrats have come up with anybody who actually does that. That's a very personal view, not a data-driven view. So the political scientists may have other explanations.
Okay, it does track, Kathy. And when you're talking about long-term in the U.S., there's this theory of critical elections and realignments and party systems. And I happen to have my first academic thesis was on that specific issue in the U.S. using realignment theory. I studied with one of the big names in the realignment world. But here's the thing. When you have a critical election that causes a realignment and the emergence of a new party system, that party system sticks and the alliance sticks, right? So just the fact that you've got Donald Trump winning, after Obama, then, Joe Biden narrowly wins, and then Donald Trump seems to be doing better again. The coalition seems to shift. Is it women? Is it a vote for the economy? Is it what is we've talked about many things, and they are not necessarily the same things we were talking about in 2016, even after the election. So, is this a realignment of the party system in the U.S.? I don't think it is. Right? Talk to me in 10 years, and maybe I'll have a very clever way to sort of analyze it and put it together and explain it. But right now, it doesn't seem that it is. It seems really that what we are watching here is the consequence of an electorate that is very uninformed. And when I mean uninformed, I don't even mean they don't know what Trump is about. No, that's not exactly what I don't mean that at all. What I mean by uninformed is that people, so we are a biased audience, right? We study politics, we're engaged, we do this stuff. You guys are here on a Wednesday watching about, elections that are happening halfway around the world. You are all interested people, right? We study these things, we read about these things, we live and breathe this stuff. The majority of voters that went to vote today in the U.S. Dedicate half a second to that decision. And they go around I was better under Trump. 4 years ago, I had a little more money. I was doing better. Now I have issues going to buy groceries. And they cast their vote, right? The majority of people is very, 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 very unengaged when it comes to politics. And so one statement here, one statement there. If you hear them interviewing people during the right after the polls, some people go Trump seems strong. What does that even mean, right? It's literally something you heard in passing while you were doing something else, and that impression stuck to you, and you go and you cast a vote. millions of people do that, and things go one way or another. So I think that's more likely as an explanation today. Again, in 10 years, I might have a very clever way to read this.
No, I think there's a kind of picture here of American politics that the answer for the Democrats to winning elections isn't coming up with a nice policy tick list. It's that, as Kathy was saying, that connection, or as Rodrigo was kind of getting at, and this is for lack of a better term, the vibes they have around a candidate, right? Trump is strong. Kamala has a funny laugh. These kind of things do stick in voters' minds. I'm happy to open it for questions now. I'm sure there's many.
Just while that's going across, I think the other thing on long-term trends is supposedly Texas has been trending blue for how many cycles now? I think every election cycle someone goes, oh, yes, Texas is in play this year, or not this year, but next cycle Texas will be in play. And Ted Cruz won his Senate race by about 9 points. So, and I think the actual presidential result was even stronger than that. So.
I lived in Texas for many years, and I have friends there who are poll observers. And one of my friends sent me an email yesterday, the day before, where they were setting up for the electoral one particular electoral office, and the county official, not one of the other volunteer observers, the county official showed up in a truck with MAGA stickers all over it, with a loaded rifle, extra bullets, a stun gun, and a bayonet, which was perfectly legal the day before the election. I haven't heard yet whether he turned up that way at the election where it would have been illegal. But that's kind of what you're dealing with. The other thing that we haven't talked about at all is voter intimidation, the suppress the vote dynamics, that which is all operates at a state level. And I think that the Texas story is very much one of intimidation. I think to a great extent. If you look at people who are eligible to register and vote, it's a very diverse state. If you look at who actually registers, and then if you look at who actually votes, very different. I think certainly in Texas and perhaps in other parts of the U.S., people with a Hispanic background are reluctant, even if they're citizens and have a passport, are reluctant to show up and vote because they're going to be treated as though they are illegal. They're going to have to prove their identity in a way that I, who am not eligible to vote in any election except for president, I could walk into any booth in America and start voting probably, more than once. But I wouldn't do that, of course. But it does create this sense of fear about your ability to exercise your vote, which I think is a big factor in, if certainly maybe not this election, not enough to turn the result, but is certainly part of the pattern of American politics now that was not so strong some years ago. Of course, before that, African Americans were denied the vote in particularly horrible ways. So,
thank you again for the panel. So, something that was mentioned early at the start of the panel is that America doesn't have like a dignified party system, with the primary systems particularly allowing for candidates like Trump to come to the fore of the party by playing to sort of like particular bases within their parties that primary. Well, I guess one of the questions. And there's the top that they don't really have like a party, too strong of like a whip or like a blackmail. But I'd argue that Trump has managed to turn the GOP into a party where if you go against him, you end up not winning in your your own internal Republican race, and so you don't get primaries. So you don't get past like your Senate or not Senate primaries, but you wouldn't get passed into the main elections. So, is there? I guess everything's potentially up right now because this is a very historic moment, but. In a post-Trump GOP, assuming he wins and then becomes a lame duck, would he still have as strong a sort of political influence as like his kind of specter of like the MAGA movement, where even though he's not in politics anymore, he can just say, "Oh, I endorse this particular guy," and then all of MAGA follows?
Let me start like this, and I don't want to seem alarmist or anything, but I have never heard before this year serious people say, I don't know if there's a next election, right? And I'm not saying that is true. I'm just saying that I have never heard serious people say that, right? That was a conversation that belonged in Fantasyland 5-10 years ago, right? And that's no longer the case. That being said, Donald Trump has transformed the GOP into the MAGA party, right? If you watch closely, Mitch McConnell, although he has gone through incredible lengths, as Kathy explained to us very, very eloquently, to do something that is unethical, immoral, weird, to quote Tim Walz, right? Wrong. So although he had done it, he was booed away during the convention, right? At that convention, there was no former Republican president, right? That is extraordinary. On Sunday or Monday, I was watching Liz Cheney calling for George W. Bush to come out and endorse Kamala Harris. Like, this is really unprecedented, right? So is there, what will happen to the Republican Party? One of two things. The Republican Party will either forget about the Trump parentheses and turn back into what it was before if a leader that is different from Trump emerges, or the Republican Party will continue. Like, let's assume that Trump just like this bows away. I don't know. His children might have political interest. Donald Trump Jr. has turned, let's quote Tim Walz again, weird, during this electoral cycle. So he might have some sort of political ambition. And so Trump may become like that kind of a grandfather figure of the party. He's going to be 82 next time around, right? But he may become that sort of like constant voice until his days are over. I don't know. We're going to have to see what happens during the next 4 years. That is whether he wins or loses, by the way.
One question, again, to go back to legal issues, is he's supposed to be sentenced in 3 weeks in New York. And, thanks to the Supreme Court, the question is whether, if he does win, he won't be president then, of course. He won't become president until sometime in January. What the sentencing judge is going to do. I think that's the thing I'm really holding out to watch. I think that's the other interesting side issue. How, as a convicted felon, was he allowed to vote? Which in most states, convicted felons are not allowed to vote. And certainly in Florida, convicted felons are not allowed to vote. Turns out that Florida allows the rules of the state where the person has been convicted to control. And in New York, a convicted felon can vote unless they are actually presently incarcerated. So that's why Trump, the convicted felon, was allowed to cast a vote for himself. Little legal footnote there.
Hi. This is a broader question about the kind of the fate of democracy in general, and I guess the implications that the election has. But you were saying before that the public vote's like, oh yeah, I guess my life kind of was better. Summer of 2016 was like peak life vibes, right? That's a bit of a meme. Like 2016 was the greatest period of human history. Do you think that, like, if somehow magically Trump seems to make every correct policy decision, gets the luck of the draw, China collapses, there's no external threat, the US just can remain the hegemon of the world, they can tariff everything with no consequences. Like, does democracy even matter if people's lives are getting better? Like, would Americans even care if Americans are living their best lives they've ever lived, right? Regardless of who Trump is, if Americans are having the best time of their lives, like, do they even care that they're under, like, the thumb of an autocrat?
Something Mussolini, make sure the trains run on time kind of vibes. To an extent.
The man on the white horse?
To an extent, if everything is going smoothly, potentially not. And I think that's, Josh has talked about this more than I have, I know, but I know in his Nat Pop Dem class, he talks about, the crisis of democracy where people got given too much democracy. And so had too many decisions to make. And I think, whilst potentially it's not wise to start quoting dictators, I think there's something to be said that if the trains run on time and you get paid and, you can do most of the things that you could do beforehand. Do you really care? And I think we see elements of that, because I would have thought that publicly denying the results of an election and the January 6th riots, insurrection, whatever you'd like to describe it to, would have been disqualifying otherwise. But when you think about the impacts, right? Like, people believe that he's going to bring the jobs back and, get rid of all the illegal immigrants and stop, the Haitians eating cats and dogs. And, if you believe that, then you kind of don't really care what he gets up to. And, to an extent, you look at some of the Schedule F stuff and that, like, clear out, the bureaucracy. You're probably on board with that. Elon Musk is in charge of government efficiency. Yeah, if you're voting for him, you go, okay, yeah, let's cut 2/3 of the bureaucracy, and then leopards eating their face when you come back and realise that the bureaucracy doesn't work. But that's the swamp's problem, right? Like, that's because the whole reason Schedule F exists is because Trump felt that his agenda was hijacked by non-partisan civil servants.
Yeah, that gets us to like a political philosophy type of consideration, right? We can go back all the way to Plato. Democracy isn't great, right? Democracy isn't that great. It's an intermediate form of government, right? As we say, it isn't great, but it is the best form that we have seen, right? Yeah. Oh, yeah. Now, does it matter? Does it not matter? Probably not, right? If everything it's the same idea, the illuminated sovereign, right? It would be funny if someone is perfect and can make all of the decisions and they're all right and everyone is happy and that person is just and it's fair and it's perfect, then great. But that doesn't exist, right? So even if for some sort of fluke, like when you stumble into your wardrobe and you come out dressed beautifully, like randomly, if Trump does that and he stumbles into the wardrobe and comes out perfectly dressed and everyone is happy, it may be okay for a little while, but if we abandon democracy, eventually something else will come. And also, these things are always, as you say, Mussolini, the trains on time. I'm Italian. I've met plenty of older people who told me, but when Mussolini, you didn't have to lock your house and the trains were on time. How about everything else, right? How about all of the other things that you weren't allowed to do and the things you weren't allowed to think? How about who you are? There are so many things, right, that statement doesn't actually consider. So, no, I think, and again, I am the director of a Center for Democracy, so you probably know what I think about democracy, but I do think I'm right. I do think we have to protect democracy at all costs.
Slight abuse of moderator privilege before we go on. Traditionally, in 20th century academia, it was democracy and development go together. People's material conditions getting better go with introducing democracy. Therefore, people support democracy because they're better off. In the 21st century, we've seen kind of the impacts on people's attitudes towards democracy and their support to it when that link and that benefit has begun to taper off. And now we're in this kind of period of uncertainty.
So over the next few weeks, we'll probably hear recriminations in the Democratic Party for how this campaign should have been handled differently. It seems like you could predict most elections by looking at how people perceive the economy. So does campaigning matter? And realistically, is there anything the Democrats could have done or anyone they plausibly could have put up and actually have had a different result?
So, given the circumstances in which Biden stepped down, it is my personal opinion that there was one candidate and one candidate only, and that was Kamala Harris. Because if you had gone away from Kamala, I think you would have, it would have led to a really, really messy primary right at the moment where you need to start finessing a message, but also is going to lead to a absolute metric ton of disaffected black and women voters who have seen you take someone that they elected to vice president and gone, we don't think she can win, and throw her to the side. That was going to have consequences. I'm less pessimistic on the idea of campaigns mattering, because I think you can campaign your way out of certain situations. That being said, if the economy or some other issue is so prevalent that it becomes the dominant issue, then it is hard to campaign your way out of that problem. I think there's going to be a lot of, as you're right, I think there's going to be a lot of recriminations in the next few days, and I think in a few weeks, and I think a lot of it is going to be from the left of the Democratic Party, either the left of the Democratic Party to the Democratic Party, or the Democratic Party to the left of the Democratic Party. So I tend to sort of think that the decision to go after disaffected Trump voters and, yes, put yourself on a stage with a Liz Cheney or all those sorts of people that you've been crying and, swearing at for the last, 2 decades was probably the correct strategy, as much as the left is probably going to sit here and go, Israel-Palestine, if you'd listened to us, we would have romped home. I'm just not convinced.
Yeah, I think we need to cut them a slack. And the reason why I think we need to do that is because this campaign has been unprecedented, right? You have a former president running, which is something that happens very, very rarely. The last one, Theodore Roosevelt, right? Grover Cleveland as well. But it's not a common thing to see. Number one. Then you've got first the two oldest people to ever run, right? Then one drops weeks before the election. I'm not even going to say months. I'm going to say weeks, right? And again, the only time a sitting president dropped in the middle of the campaign, the last time was 1968, Lyndon Johnson, and that was early in the year, was March, right? So a very late drop. Usually, a presidential campaign starts at least 1.5 years before the election, right? They don't do it like here in Australia. We do it in a few months. But in the US, it starts about 1.5 years before. So you start raising money for the primary, then you run for the primary, then you do an entire year. So it is about 1.5 years, if not longer. Kamala Harris had 107 days to come up with a campaign, a plan, And yes, she is a sitting vice president, but she wasn't that popular to begin with. She didn't have that kind of name recognition that you get if you are the sitting president. So given all of this, to pull out something that, no matter what happens, right? If she wins, if she loses, it is very close, regardless. Regardless of what the Electoral College number ends, if you look at the detail, it's quite close pretty much everywhere. I think that it's actually extraordinary. So I would cut them a bit of a slack and just say, it's what it is. Reorganize. Applause for rallying behind a candidate. They could have done fighting. They could have gone to an open convention. Like the morning that Biden resigned, I was writing articles about what will happen when they go to an open convention and start fighting about it. So the fact that they rallied within a few hours, to me, is already extraordinary. So let's just, I don't think it's fair to criticize them in to that point.
Hi again. So this is a question more directed toward Kathy. It's regarding judicial reform within the United States. Now, there's been talk, at least online and within some polling data, looking towards the United States Supreme Court and looking at a sort of question of like, do they need like a code of ethics that they need to adhere to, or should like the Supreme Court be expanded, or should term limits be put in place? Such things that we have in Australia with like I think we cap it at a certain age that you have to retire. So if Trump wins, it doesn't seem likely that there'd be any form of judicial reform. But if, by Hail Mary, Kamala Harris or the Democrats win, would there even be a chance of such an action happening? Well, not at the Senate.
I think I would tend to agree with you that if Trump wins, it ain't broke, you won't fix it, from his point of view. I think that the code of ethics point is something where the pressure is not so much coming from external political things, but from other branches of the federal judiciary. And even the state, the chief justices of all the states work collectively as well. And I think the Federal Judicial Center, which is the kind of think tank behind the U.S. federal courts, are all pushing for that. Every other court has something. And I think some of the things that have come out about the behavior of some Supreme Court justices is pretty offensive to other judges who have to live under a stricter regime. So I think there will be some greater pressure. And I think it will be interesting to see how Chief Justice Roberts responds to that. I think he's really the key there. I think expanding the court, that's such a double-edged sword. And even if the Democrats are controlling things, which they clearly, I think, are not, certainly not the Senate, I think, and that would, I'm not sure if that would require a constitutional amendment. Suzanne, do you? No, I don't think it does. I've got a colleague from the law school here. Huh? Who? Yeah. And I think term limits, I think, would require a constitutional amendment because, and I think that would be a much tougher sell. And again, there are reasons. I think on the whole, I think term limits have been a good thing in Australia. They did make that change here some years ago, and I think that is probably a good thing. The flip side, though, is a bit of a problem in the U.S. because in Australia, there's a sort of ethical prohibition on judges working after they've left the judiciary. It's seen as unethical to then appear before the court where you sat or even practice law in some ways. Some do it, but not many. Whereas in the U.S., people take judicial roles for a relatively limited time and then go out and join a mediation or arbitration service and make a great deal more money. And so I think that's the one downside of term limits, is that you have people out of judicial offices who are who still want a career. And I think that's a complicating factor about term limits.
Well, thank you to all the panelists for that discussion. Obviously, we're leaving you on the upbeat note of partisan division and perhaps institutional gridlock with little prospect for reform. But in order to have kind of a happier message, I'll hand over to Rodrigo, who wants to give some words of thanks and close.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. So this is the last panel of the day. We're closing this event now. So thank you all for attending. Before we go, there's so many people involved in organizing this, dozens of people. So I'd like to thank Flinders University and the various teams that were involved in this, all of the volunteers that came today to participate, and of course the JBC team in particular, Vasil, and most of all, Katrina Lee, who is in the back pretending that I am not talking about her. Thank you. Like, without her and without all of the team, there would be no event. So thank you all. Like, really, an amazing day with very serious consequences for everyone. Still open. We still don't know the result. So we'll be watching this all night tonight, probably all day tomorrow, maybe. But thank you all. Thanks for coming.